You're in the way. You forgot to turn the lights on. Can you turn the lights on? No, not lick me in the face. Go turn the lights on. Right, fine, I'll do it. So, Panasonic have just made a completely unexpected announcement that we knew nothing about in the form of the S1H. Now, basically Panasonic seem to have done what Sony have been doing for a few years. Now, which is go for a 3-camera setup. So they have the S1, which is the equivalent to the Sony A7. Then they have the S1R, which is a higher resolution version equivalent to the A7R. And now they've introduced the S1H, which is a more video-focused camera similar to the Sony A7S line. But the S1H has one big standout feature that everybody's going to talk about, which is that it can record 6K video and is the first full-frame camera to be able to achieve that, which is a hell of a specification, to be fair. Granted, most people aren't actually going to shoot in the full 6K, primarily because 6K is a 3:2 ratio, so it's 6,000 by 4,000 pixels, a full 24 megapixel, but it's the wrong aspect ratio for video. So most people will probably be shooting in the 5.9K, which is a conventional 16:9. The other big point to the S1H, it can do 4K at 10-bit, 60 frames a second internally. Now the specs of the S1H are very impressive, but they're also very sketchy. So we know that it will do 6K at 24 frames a second. We know it'll do 5.9K by 5.9K at 30 frames a second. And we know it'll do 4K at 60 frames a second in 10-bit. But we don't know much else. We don't know anything in terms of stills capabilities of the camera. We don't even know what the resolution of the sensor is. He's back again. You are a continuity nightmare. Speculation is, would be logical to think that this has a 24 megapixel sensor because at the end of the day, 6K is 6,000 by 4,000 resolution, which is exactly 24 megapixels. It certainly wouldn't make sense to have a higher than 24 megapixel sensor if you are going on a solely video spec camera and maxing it out at 6K. I mean, if you were going for a hybrid of a video camera with a really high resolution, but Panasonic have already got the R for that. So it's a safe bet that it's a 24 megapixel sensor. The next question that then brings up is this the exact same sensor that's in the current S1, or is it a new 24 megapixel sensor? And the reason why that for me is an intriguing question is because Sony make Panasonic sensors. So have Panasonic taken the S1 sensor and done their own revisions to it, or just needed a bigger processing unit in order to extract that extra performance, or have they had to go to Sony for a brand new 24 megapixel sensor in order to do the 6K? And if they had to then go to Sony, are Sony aware of, were they aware in advance of this S1H coming to line up? And is that why they've delayed the A7S3 launch? Is it that they had the A7S3 ready to go with maybe 4K 60 frames a second, and then they got wind that Panasonic were working on the S1H and have decided to up the ante that little bit more and go for 6K themselves? Time will tell. Now, while the specs of the S1H are without question very impressive, I also imagine that for the vast majority of people, the S1H isn't going to be a camera that they'll consider buying for a couple of reasons. Firstly is that the rumored price is $4,000, which makes it almost double the price of the standard S1. Secondly, 6K is really in its infancy at the minute. We're barely at a point where 4K is the mainstream, let alone moving on to 6K. So I imagine 6K is only really used for kind of professional filmmakers and the likes. But also, Panasonic, not only in announcing the S1H, also announced a firmware upgrade for the normal S1, which they've dubbed the DMW SFU2. Catchy name. Now, if you already own the S1, or I believe if you buy the S1 before the 30th of September, you get the firmware for free. After that, from October 1st, the firmware will cost £180. But there are some big important perks to the firmware. Firstly, is it will open up the 14 stops of dynamic range using V-Log recording, which is standard in the S1H. Secondly, you will get 10-bit 422 4K at 30 frames a second internal recording, and also 4K 422 10-bit at 60 frames a second through an external recorder. So that basically gives you the 4K capabilities of the S1H in the S1 with an external recorder. But the S1 is about £1,500 cheaper than the S1H. So if you're not needing that 6K recording, if you're only doing 4K at most, it's still going to be cheaper for you to get an S1 with the firmware upgrade and an external recorder and money left over rather than buying just the S1H. Now, all of this from Panasonic is clearly taking the fight to Sony. They've even followed the same camera lineup of a video-focused camera, a high-resolution stills camera, and then a kind of hybrid mix of both worlds kind of camera. And it begs the question, what are Sony now going to do? Because like I said, the A7S3 was supposed to be announced last year. It was speculated that it was going to be announced in October, and then October came and went, and we heard nothing. There was rumours that Sony were trying to fix overheating issues from the A7S3. Then Sony came out and said that they have the A7S3, but they're wanting to make it better than what people's expectations are. That's kind of impossible, seeing as how people's expectations are a moving goalpost, you know. Now, with the S1H, I suppose that's where people's expectations are. So is Sony going to be able to outdo the S1H? I doubt it. So what are Sony going to bring to the table? We know they're working on an A7S3. We know the cameras are capable of pulling 6K information off the sensor because the A7 III shoots 4K video that's actually 6K downsampled to 4K. So it would just be a question of not downsampling, but that's extra processing power. And can the Sony cameras handle that extra heat? If you look at the S1H, Panasonic have enlarged the body of the H over the S1 for better heat management. And the S1 was already a lot bigger than the A7 cameras. So if Panasonic have had to go for a camera that big in order to handle 6K video footage, and bearing in mind Panasonic have stipulated that the camera gets hot shooting 6K and may shut down itself to protect itself in the same way that Sony. When you're quite finished, So in the same way that Sony cameras shut themselves off, this Panasonic can potentially shut itself off if it gets too hot. So are Sony going to have to enlarge the body of the A7S III to more like what the Panasonic S1 is in order to be able to handle 6K video? Because that completely goes against Sony's philosophy of let's keep everything absolutely minute, but then you can't have everything. Well, short of strapping an entire heatsink and a fan onto the camera, but that could get quite noisy. The bigger prospect for me, to be honest, is the S1 firmware upgrade. Because the S1H is the equivalent to the A7S III in essence, or should be. So are they going to be about the same? But with Panasonic bringing out this firmware upgrade for the S1, that lays the ball straight in Sony's court of will they bring out another firmware upgrade for the A7 III? Because this S1 firmware upgrade basically takes it above everything else in terms of video features in that sort of price point. Because the Nikon Z6 and the EOS R and the A7 III can do 8-bit 420 4K internally, whereas this can do 10-bit 422 internally. And while the Nikon and the Canon can do 10-bit 422 externally, Sony can only do 8-bit 422 externally, all of them at 30 frames a second, and this can do 60 externally. Panasonic, with these announcements, have made a hell of a statement from a video shooter's perspective. So, are Sony going to respond? The ball is very much in their court now. So, are they going to soon be bringing out the A7S III in order to respond to this S1H? There is rumours that Sony will be making an announcement about a week from now on some E-mount related stuff, but we still at the minute don't know exactly what that is. And also, will they then be bringing out a firmware upgrade for the A7 III to unlock maybe some more video potential? Either 10-bit external recording or 422 internal, just something. Because remarkably enough, from a video perspective, right now in some aspects, the A7 III is actually last of the 4 big brands. And I never thought I'd hear myself say that. But what are your thoughts and opinions on this announcement from Panasonic? Are you an S1 shooter? Are you excited about this firmware upgrade? Are you actually going to be looking at getting the S1H? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.